Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, the conclusion of our workbench build. Well, I was hoping to wrap it up last week, but just way too much going on and it just didn't happen. So we're going to get into it right away and get back to the installation of that tail vise. So what I've done now is remove the plate from the bench, and this is the top plate that is recessed into our core that we glued together earlier. We need to take the bottom guide plate and place it onto the back plate of the tail vise, and if this is too proud, being the core, we need to plane this down. If it's not too proud and it's actually recessed, as mine is in this case, you're going to need to add shims. And you'll put the shims underneath this bottom plate in order to allow it to run perfectly parallel with the top plate. So I've got a piece of maple, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to plane it down ever so slightly, pass by pass, and then test fit until we get this lower guide plate running perfectly parallel with this top guide plate. Now we've got our shim installed in behind this bottom guide plate, and we just want to check the movement of this back plate for this vise, and it runs smoothly. There's very little play top to bottom, which is what we want. You don't want that thing coming through on tightening and then suddenly go off kilter and jam. So it seems to be running smoothly. So now what we're going to do is we're going to mark the holes that we need to drill to get the bolts through this assembly, and we're going to drill a 7/16 hole through the top and the bottom section of our core after we mark it. So now that the holes are drilled, you want to just go ahead. I've removed the back plate of the tail vise and reinstalled it on the side of the bench. And now we're just going to go ahead and loosely bolt together this whole assembly of the guide plates onto our tail vise core. Well, we bolted the whole assembly back together here for the tail vise, and at this point in time now, you just want to check to make sure that everything slides smoothly in and out on this tail vise. Be careful not to over tighten the bolts that hold this assembly together. Let me just show you the threshold here. Just a quarter turn is enough to jam that so that it makes it extremely difficult to move. That is not a very big threshold. So once I get this completely set, I'll be putting some Loctite on these bolts just to keep them from loosening or tightening by vibration or whatever. Now what you need to do before you move on is check this assembly to make sure the travel on the bench. And what I mean by that is over the full extension of its travel, both fully extended and fully retracted, we want to make sure that this thing isn't sloping down or sloping up. So I'm just going to get some setup blocks and stack them on here until they're flush with the top of the bench, and then we'll go back and forth and just make sure that there's no travel. If there's no deviation from that and it's traveling true to the top of the bench, then we're going to go ahead and drill the other two mounting holes and finish screwing in this back plate of the tail vise. So we've got the whole vise assembly sat in there and we're happy with it. The extra bolts have been put, or screws rather, have been put in. And now we've got our front section of the tail vise that gets glued onto here. There'll be two of these, but this particular one will get bench dog holes drilled in it. So I've marked them and center punched them as per the print, and we're going to go ahead and drill 3/4 through holes in this particular piece of board. Well, now with the bench dog holes drilled, what we need to do now is, with this whole assembly still attached to the bench, we need to glue this front piece onto our tail vise core, and we're going to leave it about a 32nd of an inch proud so that we can plane it flush afterwards. And now we'll just wait until this glue is set, and then we'll be gluing this other core piece onto the outside of this one. So this is about as dry as it's going to get for now. So what we're going to do is we're going to clamp this board in place in front of it just like that, and we're actually going to mark here for some biscuits, simply just to help me with alignment. So I'm going to go ahead now and mark for those biscuits, cut them, and glue and clamp them up as you've seen me do on this build several times. No need to see it again. And now we've got that outside, I don't know if you call it a core piece, but it's the outside piece of the tail vise is now glued into place, and the squeeze up has been cleaned up just like I showed you in some of the other parts with just a 1-inch scraper. So we're going to let this dry up now, and when we come back after letting this fully dry, we're going to start working on filling in this area here, and then we're pretty much coming down to the light at the end of the tunnel for this tail vise. Well, the next step that we need to do, as I said, is to fill this void that's here. And what you want to do is pull your vise all the way in until it butts into your bench. And we've already laminated this piece together, and that just sits in there just like that. So we want to make sure that we have it the way that we like it there. And then once we get that set up, what we need to do is get a couple pieces of double-sided tape down onto this plate. Then what we're going to do is place our board here down tight onto the plate, take apart the bottom bolts of the tail vise, and then gently lift this up so that our plate is still attached. The reason for that is we're going to flip it over at that point, and there's 2 mounting screw holes here that we can then transfer the marks in, drill the pilot holes, and then go ahead and screw that together. This piece does not get glued in. This piece is screwed in to that underlying steel plate of the tail vise itself. We've marked the holes, drilled them, put in our number 14 by 3/4 inch screws to hold this plate onto that top assembly, and now we're going to go ahead and put our tail vise back together where it belongs on the side of the bench. Well, coming around to the back side of the tail vise now, you can see that there's a little bit of an overhang right here, and those are the boards that we just put in. So on our end cap block, we need to basically cut a rabbet in this 3/4 of an inch wide, and whatever the thickness or the depth is of that overhang. So I've marked this block, and now I'm going to go ahead and cut that rabbet, and we're going to fit this block into place. And there's our rabbet in the little end cap here, and that just sits on the end there. So we're going to glue that in and clamp it into place. There are some imperfections here in the end where it's not lying exactly flat. So I'm just going to take the block plane and just trim it up ever so slightly just to get things to lie flush when I put the end cap on there. And the next piece, of course, we want to put on is the end cap for this tail vise. So we're going to need to bore 1.5 inch through hole here, as well as some 7/32 through holes, 3/4 by 3/4 in on each side, and we're going to countersink those as well. Well, there's our end cap, and now what we're going to do is we're going to hold it in place here. I'm going to drill some pilot holes, and we're going to screw this into place. The next thing to do is to screw the vise screw all the way in to the tail vise. And when you get it
snugged in there, then what you want to do is line up this plate and mark the holes. Then we're going to drill those holes, and we're going to put in some number 14 by 3/4 screws to hold this plate securely where it needs to be. And with that, now our tail vise is securely in place and seems to work just fine. But it would be nice, instead of using a screwdriver, to have a handle. And for that, we're going to head over to the lathe with some of the offcuts from this maple. So I've got some scraps and offcuts. And what I'm going to do is, they're 12 inches long. I'm going to take them over to the lathe and turn them down to 1 1/8 inch diameter. However, on the one end, I'm going to leave a knob, and I'm going to show you that once I get it turned. And with that, we have a vise handle. And now all that's left to do to this is to turn a knob that will sit over this end and screw into the end of this handle so that it doesn't fall out of the vise. So I'll just show you how this fits into the end mechanism. And this is at the tail vise, and of course this just fits into the end. And this here now will receive another end cap, so that should it end up in this position, it's not going to fall right out. So I'm going to go ahead and make those end caps, but I'm going to do that at a later time. For now, I'm just going to turn another one of these handles. So I'm just going to go through a quick overview of how I make the end caps for these handles. Bottom line is 1 1/8 diameter, so I cut off a piece of stock that's 1 1/4 long, and then I drill an 1 1/8 1/2 inch deep hole in the bottom of it. And bottom line is, I use a stem center at the headstock and a live center at the tailstock, and I turn it until I get one of these. And then when I get this, of course, this goes on top of here and screws in the end, and there is your handle with both ends so that it won't fall through. So now I'm going to carry on, turn the other end cap for these handles, and we're going to move right along on this bench. Well, the final piece that we need to make for the bench is the tool well sweep out, and it's basically just a ramp, which is the same width as this. I made mine 7 inches long. I cut the top of the board at a 30-degree angle, and then what I did was I took a block plane and just continually shaved the end with the block plane until it fit in the tool well. And that is just going to get glued in place just like that. And what that is for is, you get sawdust in the tool well, now you can sweep it out and right out onto, well, of course, your floor. And that's what the floor is for. Well, the next step in this process now is to take out any uneven glue-ups here. And the way I'm going to be doing that is with number 6 4-plane. And I'm going to be going over the entire bench surface, checking it with a straight edge. As well, with the vices closed, we need to plane those tops of the jaws flush with the edge of the bench. So that's a lot of work, and that's a lot of planing. So enough talking, let's get to it. So I finished planing the bench, and that's a lot of work. So I've checked it. I'm happy with its flatness. So now I'm going to take the belt sander to it, give it one final sanding over with the belt sander, then I'm going to move to the random orbital and get it so that it's nice and smooth all over, and then after that we're going to apply the finish. So the bench has been planed, flattened with the hand planes, sanded with the belt sander, then I went random orbital, then quarter sheet, and sanded to a grit of 220, and she's as smooth as glass. However, we've got these sharp edges, and I know what maple is like, and that crisp corner there, I'm going to end up getting cut on that at some point in time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around with my trim router, and I'm going to put a round over on all these sharp corners. I don't know, maybe a 1/8 round over would be fine, just to soften it up. Just if you're going to do that, just make sure that you do not do on the inside of your vices. That's not going to work. So once I get all of this routed up and give it one more quick sanding, then we're going to get into the finish. Well, I've got all the chamfering done. I actually used a 1/8 round over, and I did all around the outside edges, everything but the faces of the vice jaws. I even did the inside of the bench dog holes. Everything looks great. I've got the bench disassembled now, being the top off the stand, and we're ready to do the finish. Now, what I've done is made sure everything is sanded, I've wiped everything down, and then I used a tack cloth to make sure all the dust was off. Now my finish of choice for this bench is tung oil. So we're going to start with the first coat, and what we're going to do is we're going to cut the tung oil 50-50 with some mineral spirits, and that's going to thin out the viscosity and really allow the oil to soak into the wood. So be generous with that first coat. Get it all soaking in, give it about a half an hour, and then you can go around after that half an hour and wipe off any of the runs and that sort of thing. But you want to be generous with the first coat, and like I said, thin it out 50% and 50% with mineral spirits and the tung oil. Well, I've already coated the stand, and like I said, this first coat is it's pretty much the easy coat, because you just want to slop the stuff on. But the thing with tung oil is you've got quite a bit of versatility as to the application. If you want to use a brush, use a brush. If you want to use a cotton rag, use a cotton rag. If you want to use steel wool, use steel wool. You could pretty much apply it with whatever the heck you want. But I don't know if this is showing on the camera or not, but this is really bringing out the grains and really giving this a deep look to it. It really brings out the grains and the colors of the maple, and it's going to look fantastic when we're all done. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this first coat. Like I said, 50-50 mix between mineral spirits and tung oil, and you want to give it 24 hours to dry between the coats. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this bench here with the first coat, and I'll see you back here in 24 hours. And with that, coat number 1 is complete. I really don't think that the camera is showing it, but this thing is just a gorgeous yellowy maple. It just looks great. Bottom line is, we're going to come back in 24 hours, make sure it's dry, and then I'm going to show you what to do with that second coat. Well, we're back to hit this with the second coat, and what you want to do here is you want to make sure that this coat is dry, and a simple drag test will tell you that. And what I mean by that is just take your fingers and lightly run it over the surface of your piece, and it should be smooth to the touch. There should be no drag at all, no resistance, any little bit of resistance as you run your fingers over it should tell you that it's not 100% dry, and you want to give it some more time before you go ahead and apply that next coat. So this one is fine. What you may find is because you've applied that mineral spirit and tung oil mixture, you may experience a little bit of raising of the end grain, even some raising of the long grain. It's completely possible, and it's completely normal. So don't freak out. What you want to do is get some 600 grit wet dry sandpaper, and using oil as your lubricant, being the tung oil, just get in there and lightly sand those areas of the raised grain, and it'll take care of those no problem. So now that we've got this prepped, the wet sanding is done in the raised grain areas, which would have been in the vise area here for me in particular, and a couple areas of the legs. Now we want to go ahead and apply the next coat of the tung oil, and that will be applied 100% pure, no thinners, just the straight up tung oil. And we're going to use a cotton rag, a lint-free cotton rag for that. And what you want to do for that is you want to apply the oil to the rag and wipe it onto your piece. Now, you don't want to saturate. You don't need pools of tung oil lying all over the bench. But what you want to be doing is rubbing that tung oil on so that as a light touch goes across the bench, it's leaving the wood behind it wet to the look. It's going to look wet. You don't want pools of it, and you don't want to have to be putting pressure on that rag to squeeze that oil out of there. If you're running it across and it's kind of a dry application, put more oil on the rag. So once you apply it to the whole bench, give it 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, and then you want to take a clean rag from there and wipe off all the excess, and then 24 hours to cure. So here we are now about 25 minutes after the application, and we're just going to go along and take off any of the excess that's still sitting on the top. If it hasn't soaked in by now, it certainly isn't going to. So just going to give it a light wipe, and you're not trying to buff it. There are some people who say that you really got to buff it at this stage and get it to work in. I don't know. I don't buy into that. I say just wipe off the excess and let it cure in naturally on its own. So I'm going to go ahead and finish wiping off the excess on the bench here. We're going to leave it for 24 hours, and then what we're going to do is carry on after that and put another coat, and then another coat, and another coat. And truth be told, I'd like to get at least 3 coats on the bench top and the legs, and I might even go so high as to have 10 coats on the top of the bench itself. I'm going to play it by ear as I go. So you don't need to see me repeat this process. This is it. This is the process. You can sand with some 4/0 steel wool in between coats if you like. But other than that, this is it. So we're going to get the finish on. We're going to get it all done up and put together and put in place. And then after all that jazz, I'll come back and see you. Okay, and now it's time for
Kenbo's commentary.
Spared no expense on that special effect. Anyway, guys, the bench is done. The finish is on. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. But I want to run through a few things here that I learned while taking care of and building this bench. And I'm just going to run through them with you. Number one here is your vise dimensions. The bench build itself went very smoothly. However, once I started getting involved with installing the vise, both the tail and the front vise, the problems started. And I think it was partially my own fault because I was under the assumption that the plans that I was looking at were tailored to the vices that I purchased, and that was my mistake. You want to make sure that your vise dimensions are right on, and check your fit for everything that you're putting in. For example, in an episode back a while, I showed you how the back plate of the tail vise gets mounted ½ an inch in from the butt end of the end cap. Not the case. I ended up having to move that back another inch because the hardware of that tail vise interfered and wouldn't let it close all the way. And the more I looked into it, it's because the plans were actually tailored for a 480 mil, so they say, tail vise, and mine was a 400, which is a 15 inch. So I'm not sure the difference in the two. 15, 17 inches, it makes no difference. So basically, check the dimensions of your vices and coordinate them with what you see on the plans so that your installation won't be as troublesome as what mine was. Biscuits for glue ups. Now, whether you want to use dowels or biscuits or anything like that, the actual flattening of the top of this bench was fairly minimal, and although it was still a lot of work, there wasn't a lot to be done as far as the planing goes, because I went that extra step and used biscuits to do the glue ups, trying to keep my alignment on my boards as best I could. And the more prep that you put into that and into your glue up like that with either dowels or biscuits or what have you, the more luck you're going to have and the less work you're going to have flattening that bench down the road. So think about it, and you may want to look into biscuits for your joinery there on those glue ups. Here's what I didn't think of. Snipe on your planer. It's inevitable that in a thickness planer sometimes we get snipe. Now there's all kinds of things, like on the 734 you have the manual lockdown that helps to minimize snipe. On 735 it's got an automatic lockdown, etc., etc. But when you're planing a 7-foot, 8-foot board, once it gets down to exiting the planer, unless you've got an outfeed table down the line that's set perfectly to hold that where it's supposed to be, there's going to be some sag in the board that's going to bring up the back end into the blades, and you're going to get some snipe. And I'm going to tell you right now, on these long boards, I was getting almost 3 inches of snipe per board. So if you're not positive on your setup, you may want to think about that, and of course allow for a little extra length on your board to get rid of the snipe. Because I don't care how good you are, no matter how much you sand that snipe, it always shows in your final product. Slice it off, man. Give yourself the extra length to allow for the snipe so you can just cut it off, get rid of it, and not ruin the look of your project by having this snipe at the end. The front vise, and yeah, I've got notes. The front vise, the template that I used, you saw the problem I had where I ended up having to cut out another ½ inch of material out of my bench core. Well, that again was using the template, but my fault for not double checking and making sure everything fit. And bottom line, I guess, there is do your testing, do your extra checking, you know, double check, check, double check again, and then do your cutting. But of course, now talking about double checking measurements, let's look back at the other video earlier where, of course, I ended up having that extra hole that I ended up plugging. And in retrospect, it really doesn't bother me that much. It kind of bothered me at first that I screwed up like that because I'm one of these, you know, check twice, cut once kind of guys. But I screwed up. There's nothing more you can say. And if you don't want a blemish like that on your bench, then double check your measurements before you make any cuts. The half-blind dovetails for the back wall to the end caps of the tool well, You could do butt joinery there if you want. You could use dowels. But this is, hate to break it to you, a woodworking bench. So why not incorporate some woodworking skills into it and do the dovetails? I suck at dovetails, and hopefully some of you will look at the butcher job that I did on them and you'll do a little better on yours. Maybe take that as a bit of inspiration. But for me, I'm not that good with them, and but I still went with it, and I'm very happy with the results. Those dovetails, regardless of how imperfect they are, they add character to the bench and they make it what it is, and that is a woodworker's bench. So do the dovetails, guys. I think you'll be happy with it. The leg positioning of the whole stand in relation to the front vise. I went with the plans with that 8.5 inches in from the one end, and I measured that and checked it, double checked, checked it, double checked. But what I didn't check was that position of those legs with my front vise installed. And truth be told, it collided. So I ended up, after having those 1-inch holes drilled for those dowels and having everything aligned and everything so wonderful, I ended up having to reposition and redo those holes and move everything down because it was out by about 3/4 of an inch, just enough to get in front or in the way of the guide rods for the front vise and make it so that nothing worked. So once again, check, check, check. Helpers. You want to get a helper for the glue ups if you can. Just handing you things, getting things into position, helping with the clamps. It's a big glue up for a lot of these boards, and it's kind of cumbersome. It's slippery because of all the glue. It's messy. Get yourself a helper. And as the glue ups progress and that tabletop becomes heavier, that core with the front skirt and the tail vise and the tool well and the end caps and all of that jazz, good gosh, it weighs a ton. So you really want to get yourself a helper to help maneuver this thing around because it is quite cumbersome, and the last thing you want is to throw your back out while you're working on that. So get yourself a helper. Here's another one here. Longer drill bits. Some of the holes that had to be drilled here, such as the bench dog holes, and some of the holes for the hardware for mounting the end caps onto the core, and the bolts for the stretchers onto the leg assemblies, you needed a longer drill bit. So you may want to check your tool arsenal, your drill bit arsenal, to make sure that when you're going to make your bench that you have drill bits that are going to suit. And last but not least, something I learned the hard way, the top plate, the top guide plate of the tail vise. They say that it's identified by 4 holes. Well, the top and the bottom have 4 holes, and they don't line up. They are completely different. And I had a 50-50 shot, and I shot wrong. So the top plate of your tail vise actually is the one that has the 2 threaded holes in it, because the bolts will come up through the bottom and thread into that top plate. So keep that in mind when you're lining up that top plate to route out the recess for it in the tail vise. You want to make sure that that top plate has the threads in it. And with that, that's all I have for
Kenbo's commentary.
And there you have it. Wow. What can I say other than wow? A great build, a ton of work, a lot of fun, a lot of mess. Guys, this particular bench was just way more labor intensive than I ever thought it was going to be, but absolutely worth every second of it. How many hours or how much time would it take you to make a bench like this? I've got over 120 hours logged in on this one, but 120 hours of time well spent. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. What you see is what you get. Guys, I don't know what to tell you other than I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you've enjoyed this series. I know 6 half-hour videos, that's not bad when you consider that I crushed over 120 hours of labor into only 3 hours of video, and that includes all my tomfoolery and you know, my mouth flapping like that. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's inspired you to make your own benches, because it was a heck of a lot of fun. And there's nothing more really to say other than I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.